most of you know the first-year students. We read David Wallace-Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth. Professor Matt Eggemeyer, is Matt here? There he is, Dean Eggemeyer. One of the people who suggested that and suggested this panel. Of course, one way you could finish reading that book is to say, why go to college, why do anything? It's awfully scary and there's no particular hope. Yet he also had an ability, I think, to make us look and say, maybe something little where much good as the water bottle is, water bottles aren't going to get us there, or something like that, to really focus on the depth of the problem. So we decided this semester that we would also include a fishbowl discussion with some faculty who were prepared to talk about that and some students who were prepared to talk about that. If you haven't been to a fishbowl discussion, it's going to be a bit like a conversation, a moderated conversation among us that you get to watch us do for a little while. At some point, probably in a half an hour, I'll break it open and let some other people make some comments and include themselves in that. So we'll do that that way. And let me just introduce our fish, if you will. And they're not panelists. We don't want it to be a panel where they talk really long and they feel as if every time you make a comment, they all have to answer. So we're trying to make it really much more of a lively conversation. Kendy Hess is Brake Smith Associate Professor in Social Philosophy and Ethics, Director of the Chioka Center for Business Ethics and Society, with a background as a corporate environmental lawyer. Her scholarly work has focused on corporate agency and moral obligation with secondary interests in capitalism, the environment, and the nature of work. Come on in, sit in the back. Everybody, any event I do, people fill in from the back, I know. So, Ellis Jones is Assistant Professor of Sociology, whose work is concerned with corporate social responsibility, mass media, and ethical consumerism. As a public sociologist, peace and conflict, sustainability, and social movements. I left those out. As a public sociologist, he speaks often on ways to address global, social, and environmental problems, and authored the Better World Handbook and the Better World Shopping Guide. Katherine Kiel is Professor of Economics, focused on environmental economics and urban economics. She co-chairs the Presidential Task Force on the Environment here at the college. Her current research explores the impact of various kinds of pollution on housing prices, and she's written on how local environmental changes affect home values, how those values help estimate demand curves, for environmental goods, and the economic benefits of environmental remediation. Renee LeBlanc is a member of the class of 2021, majoring in environmental studies and political science. Concerned with sustainability on campus, she serves on the Presidential Task Force on the Environment and co-chairs Eco Action. Recently, she organized the college's participation in the global climate strike. And Sara Mitchell is a geologist who studied climate science, Earth's climate history, the role of CO2 in climate, and the role of climate in mass extinctions. Her current research focuses on relationships between climate, tectonics, and erosion and the topographic development of mountain ranges. An associate professor in the Department of Biology and director of the Geosciences program, she teaches courses including environmental geology, paleoclimatology, and natural disasters. So, natural disasters is a good person to bring in my relationship to this. I'll let people know that we are recording the conversation. That'll be available online, so if you speak, you're being recorded. Nothing to fear about that, but just so that people know. And maybe to start, there were three things we thought we would cover in the time that we were here in particular. But one of them is to maybe briefly, if we will, sort of talk about the summarize and assess the claims that are made in the book. When I did this with a faculty group when we were there, I found there was nobody who wanted to say the book is entirely wrong, which is pretty depressing given all that it says. But maybe, Sara, you, since this is more in your wheelhouse, how do you think of, is this wrong?
I wish. I mean, there's a part in this book that I thought was actually really funny, sad, scary, where it's now time for scientists to freak out, and I think we're at that, right? I think that's absolutely true. That the vast majority of claims made in here about carbon dioxide, its role in climate, its role in past mass extinctions, and its predicted ability to change our temperature into the future. That's all very well established science. There's nothing surprising out of line of mainstream, just total mainstream climate science. for all of that. So, and a lot of it has been known for a very long time. So for example, the claim that CO2, like doubling CO2 would raise temperatures by 5 degrees, we've known that since the 1800s.
5 degrees centigrade.
Centigrade, sure. So 9 degrees or whatever Fahrenheit. We've known that since the 1800s, and there's been articles in the scientific literature about climate, global warming related to burning of fossil fuels and CO2, predicting 4 or 6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century since the 1970s. So that's all old hat. None of that was surprising to me. So.
Surprising to any of us here? What is this book? Does the book add anything for you as you read it, looked at it?
One thing that I found striking about the book is, I've been teaching this stuff for 15 years now. I've read 1,000 student papers about this problem and that problem. So I kind of felt like I really kind of knew what was going on with climate change. And I understood the basic mechanism and all that. But the thing that was striking for me about this book and about the article that preceded it is how many dimensions, how many different parts of the world get out of whack when the climate starts to change. The disease vectors changing, and the forest fires, and the stuff coming out of the permafrost, and the rise in human violence that tracks with change. Never thought about that, although the minute you say it, it's kind of obvious. But that all of these different aspects of climate that I hadn't really thought of as part of climate change, that it's so much more than just a geological or climate problem. So it was way worse than I thought it was.
More than just physical science.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
I think that's part of what interested me about this work. It's not like we haven't read other things on climate change, but David Wallace-Wells comes from the space of essentially trying to play the role of us, being not quite as informed as we should be, and then realizing that during his research, he essentially busts 3 of his own major myths. One is, that climate change is going to happen in the future, right? Which we're all thinking climate change is the boiling the frog problem. We're all sort of slowly feeling it, but we're not really feeling it. And so he breaks that myth and demonstrates how it's actually happening right now, and it's coming very quickly. And then he talks about how it is taking place not just on coastlines or in certain areas of the world, and other areas will be safe, but rather everybody gets affected. And then the severity, I was there when An Inconvenient Truth was in the theaters with Al Gore, and the thing that sticks with me to this day are all of those images of New York City flooding and all the cities flooding, in Florida flooding, and so it was all about sea level rise. And again, he kind of debunks that myth very carefully, talking about it's not sea level rise, that's just such a small part of what is happening. In fact, it's much more severe and interconnected, like you were saying. And so this problem suddenly has some very significant challenges for us to face.
So if everybody's affected, why isn't there a big, I know you're leading a big movement, but why isn't there, is it just that we don't know what you've known since the 70s, or you've known since you started environmental law, or what's?
Because I've been teaching this for over 20 years, and every year I'm like, it's coming sooner, and I was struck by it freaked me out, and I thought I wasn't going to get freaked out.
I thought I knew
it's
this.
now, we have a year, here we go. And so thinking about why aren't people freaking out, and maybe it's people are unaware of it, but I also think some of it is just sort of human nature. I'm just one person. I can only do so much. It's bigger than me. I don't know how to manage it. And so I think people are just I don't know, a head in the sand,
or helpless, or
yeah.
So those are
What
two
can I
different-
do?
One of the biggest things I think what happens is a lot of people are like, the government needs to make a change, the whole world needs to make a change. It's like it's on the UN's plate. It's only them that can happen. They have to do it. It's not us. And that's where one of the biggest things, and they talk about it in the book. It's about how while you can demand globally, there's really what you have to do locally. It's local action that's actually going to make that difference. And it's not going to be your reusable straw, but it's going to be big movements in demanding that your school does a green fund, your school gets a sustainability director, things that we're trying to do here. And that's when you can not freak out as much about these global issues, because you realize when you freak out about the global issues, it's just really hard and it doesn't help anyone's mental stability on these. But when you do look at it from even just your family, what can you do in your family? Is your family eating meat every single day? Can you help stop that? Yes, you can. And that's in the sense that he says he's he's optimistic about this because people can make those changes and demand on that local scale more than you really can demand on that global big scale, besides in the action of big large scale protests or simple day-by-day voting.
One thing that for a while everybody was pushing lifestyle change, the 70s, 80s, 90s, you gotta use your reusable mug, and that's how we're gonna fix this.
Get new lights, better light bulbs.
Yeah, better light bulbs is gonna do it all, right?
Yeah.
And now it's quite clear that that's not gonna do it. We need big, concerted, probably government-driven action. And so the lifestyle thing has kind of gotten a bad reputation. But one of the most important things that lifestyle change does, well, for one thing, there's the ethics of it. There's the kind of person you want to be in the world that you're living in, and so that's an ethical question that's not just about what you're accomplishing, but about who you are and how you are. But there's also the fact that those lifestyle changes are how we signal to our elected leaders that we're ready, we are willing, that if they push for these environmental things, we'll back them. They're not going to get punished for acting in an environmentally conscious way. And so, first it was all lifestyle change, and then it was no lifestyle change, and I think it's kind of coming back around to there's some real value in that lifestyle change, even given the fact that that's not going to fix it, that we shouldn't just forget about that part of it.
So I can't help thinking, I thought I'd never use the phrase poor Emmanuel Macron, but Macron pushed a lot of these things,
And then
he got the yellow
snapped
vest
for it.
movement. He's been
Yep.
pushed back, he's been really kicked in the ass over
Yep.
it by ordinary people who probably are aware that something bad is coming. So does that help? Is there a powerlessness that politicians have?
They can only follow in a weird way. Like, we keep saying that they should lead, but if it's a democracy, they can't really, like, they can, it's this back and forth kind of thing.
It reminds me of when we had President Obama. I remember a few times him saying, I want you to force me to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Right? He was talking to the public. He needed the public to force him to do the right thing because he wanted to do it, but he felt like it was not going to go over well. He's going to have to spend too much political capital. And so the idea is that it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. You need the public behind it to allow the politics to change, and you need the politics to change to make the change happen so that the public can get on board. So there's a little bit of a back and forth going on. It strikes me, though, one of the things I've listened to interviews with David Wallace-Wells. On the one hand, I think he is a little bit critical of the lifestyle changes. In the old way of thinking that we can't get caught in the trap of thinking that exclusively these kinds of changes are actually going to add up to anything, because actually they're probably not. But rather, he comes back around later to say that there's no silver bullet. And while we need deep structural changes, political and cultural and systemic, that everybody needs to find their own contribution as well. And you're right, these lifestyle changes are often great ways to practice, they're great ways to signal each other, they're great ways to be ready for when the politics starts to come around and there's a window of political opportunity that you are ready because you have been practicing all of these things. You can recognize it as the time to act. All of those things, I think, come into place. So I think, again, one of the problems that this brings up is us kind of radically going from one side of the pendulum to the other. So climate deniers, right, it's not happening, all the way over to essentially climate nihilists, which is, it's happening, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. And really, when you think through problems like this, at first they look very black and white until you start to parse them out and realize that there is really just a spectrum of options. And there are, like LEED certification, if anybody knows about LEED certifying buildings, there are many ways to get to the solution or to the LEED certification, but you have to begin to think about it in kind of collective, parsed terms that don't either undermine individual action or undermine collective action.
Yeah.
And I do feel like with Macron, some of the problems in France was that individuals felt very put upon.
Right.
It was like, oh, it's only affecting me, I'm the one paying the price, as opposed to, as a society, we have a problem, we're going to work together to fix it, and we're all going to take a hit, but we're all taking a hit in a way that is acceptable to us.
Yeah. And that's going to vary a lot society to society in terms of, how much we feel that we are in a shared community of some kind. People have very different experience of bearing costs when there's a sense of true community versus where it's all just individualistic stuff. And it's one of the reasons that we have trouble in America doing this, is we have such an individualistic political culture.
Yeah, if it feels like it's just your standard of living that is going down because of choices you're making, it's hard to sell that to everybody.
Yeah.
Well, is it our standard of living that needs to go down? I mean, one thing I'm aware of since we started talking about this, I was in Chennai in India, where it was 95 degrees every day and more humid than you can imagine. Yeah. And people wanted air conditioning, and they, I wanted air conditioning, go out for a walk in the middle of the day. So what people wanted and needed, yes, I contributed to it, to global warming. So there are things that I have to cut back on. Is that even enough in a global context? Going back to the hopelessness question, people in some of those contexts have every right to want more. And as they want more, as they deserve, perhaps. How do we balance that, I think?
It seems to me, back to Macron, that one of the problems was recognizing or not recognizing, the failure to recognize that certain people in France were already suffering. And so if you ask them to now bear an extra burden on top of their suffering when they see a divide between them and others within the society, it's just not going to float with those people. They are looking for an end to that level of suffering. And so for you to come in and say, hey, everybody, we're all in this together now, we'll all need to cut out this air conditioning stuff by 50%, it's just not going to fly. There has to be a recognition, and this is why we get back to things like Laudato Si in the Pope's encyclical, where he's trying to match environmental problems with human suffering as well. You have to put the two together, or else it looks like, this white elitist, privileged environmental movement is coming down and, sanctioning everybody else for doing the wrong thing, when in fact there are so many people suffering in the first place.
So I'm glad you mentioned Laudato Si. One of the things you did say earlier in Laudato Si, the papal encyclical on the environment, you said earlier, we're all going to suffer. But Pope Francis says, no, we're not all going to suffer. So the poor are going to suffer in particular.
Well, and that's, I think, another strength of this book is essentially recognizing that the responsibility for climate change is unequally borne within the global society. So both the suffering is going to be meted out unequally, so that the poor and the people who are already being exploited around the world are going to suffer much more, and that the responsibility to do something about it is actually much more on the shoulders of the wealthier countries around the world, because of our role in causing it in the first place and how much we contribute to it.
But going back to what you'd said, I think at the very beginning, we're all going to suffer. Not necessarily. I think if you're rich enough and you got in before New Zealand stopped letting people buy property on their island, which I think they passed that, Yeah, there were so many wealthy people trying to buy estates in New Zealand that they actually tried to pass a law that you had to live on the island for however long before you could buy property. I don't know if it passed or not. So, if I have enough money that I can buy guards and build a walled compound with a well, and it may not be as good as it has been here, but I'm not going to suffer the way people who don't have the money to do that kind of thing are going to suffer. And I think that's true. And I also think that that's part of what's lurking in the back of people's minds when they're not doing anything about this. That my world may get more unpleasant, my world may get more uncomfortable, but I'm not going to be the one whose life is completely disrupted by this. I don't know if they're right, but I think that's also part of what's going on, that it's not just helplessness and it's not just hopelessness, it's a bet that I can get through this without disrupting my life.
Yeah, I mean, looking at all the hurricanes that have been going on, you look at the sense of if somebody has good insurance for their house and their home gets destroyed, that one person that doesn't have as good of insurance for their house, they can rebuild. So those wealthy neighborhoods, they're going to go up. in months, in a year. But the ones, like, there's still hurricane towns, like, there's still towns that just destroyed. No one's ever moving back in those areas. No one had insurance to repay for those homes, and that's environmental justice. If you have a border from one neighborhood to another, the rich neighborhood to the poor neighborhood, they're going to go live in hotels for how many ever months, go live on the street somewhere if they need to. Where they're living in a nice hotel, they're going to be totally fine. And they're going to go back to their house in a month, and it's probably going to get destroyed at the next hurricane, but they'll just rebuild.
Get another one.
So there's on the one level, there's class tyranny, right? There's this idea of the wealthy, well, they don't have to worry about the problem as much because they can buy their way out of it, like most problems. And the poor always have to worry about it because they're barely making it come together right now. And so if you give them more to do, right, they're going to fall apart as well. But there's also a kind of intergenerational tyranny that I think we need to talk about, which is that there are people who are essentially going to die off before the problem really gets bad, right? Maybe including me, right? And there is no accountability in our system currently for that kind of intergenerational tyranny. I remember thinking about this a long time ago in graduate school when I started to notice things like the national debt in the US and these growing deficits and how much every person would have to pay in future generations. And I thought, well, that's very irresponsible. Like, how is there no law against that? And of course, we keep digging ourselves down that hole. But this is even more extreme, right? That somebody needs to take care of the problem, but the people that are in the positions of power, most of them are in those generations that are not going to experience the full brunt of this problem, and therefore essentially like charging up the credit card for a party before they leave and then leave the bill for somebody else. That's sort of this generation handing it over to the next. So there needs to be some kind of reconciling of that intergenerational problem as well.
When you do see it too in some of the proposed solutions. Oh, technology is going to solve this. There's some bright person somewhere in this room who's going to figure out the carbon capture way, and it's all going to be good. And we're just banking on that, and it seems like a risky strategy. Yeah. So
as an economist, they range from carbon capture or from solutions that are around taxing carbon. What do you see? Any solutions on the horizon that you get?
I'm a big carbon tax person. I've been arguing for carbon tax for a long time because to me it's a market failure. That's why we see all these problems. And if you put a true price on carbon, and then people are going to have to make decisions, and suddenly coming up with new technology to solve these problems becomes a possibility, and people work harder on it. And
could you explain the concept behind it, just for anyone who's not familiar with it?
Sorry. So the idea of carbon tax is that everything that gets produced, we'll figure out how much carbon goes into making that, or how much carbon is released in the making of that, and then you put a tax on it. However, you have to figure out what the dollar value is. But what the thing I like about carbon tax, rather than setting a quota, this is how much carbon we're going to allow to release, is that revenue is generated, and then we can decide what to do with that revenue, and whether it's refunding money then to the people who are hit the hardest, whether it's saying we're going to reduce the income tax or something else. There is a way. We have a mechanism then to try to even things out a little bit in a way that we don't have as much control over if we have sort of the cap and trade sort of idea. But at this point, whatever it is people will agree on, I'm with it. I'm with it.
Yeah.
So the basic idea is that polluting it's an externality.
Yep.
So you are polluting, someone else is paying
Yep.
for it, and if you pollute, you're getting to do it for free. So is it a tax, or is it really a way to get people, when you come down, or people to pay for what the damage they're causing?
It's a polluter pays, and if you set the price right, then when people are making those decisions, they're going to have to decide, is it worth it to me to pollute or not? And if it's not, then I'm going to have to figure out a way to stop the pollution. But people have been doing it for free for a very long time, so 1800s, okay? So I feel like it's been unfair all along, and we have to figure out a way to make it fair. And for me, that's the more appealing process. But
As a scientist, when you look at what that could do, do you feel like is that like plastic straws, or is that like a big step? Or?
I think anything that would put like big pressure to reduce carbon is a good thing. I mean, I think I was talking with my colleague Robert Burton earlier today, and we're still in, I see him behind there, we're still in the point where we can recover from this, right? Like we're at the point, if we decide to change things soon, then we're looking at 2 degrees C instead of 5 degrees C, and that's a good thing, right? That's better. That's better.
Change things soon means what exactly, like percentage-wise or decrease?
Oh, I don't have any idea what those numbers would be. Go to 0.
Yeah.
I mean,
we only have
eventually.
like a couple years to start making big changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other advantage, I think, of the carbon tax idea is, this is something else I noticed along the way. One of the advantages of this problem in general, if it has any, is that it's very quantifiable. And I find that our society deals very well with numbers. Once you put a number, like human suffering is very difficult because you can't put a number on it and say, you're suffering 7, you're 10, and therefore we'll take care of those numbers. This, on the other hand, is about, gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions and sulfur dioxide. And we can measure those. We have numbers and we can work with numbers. And then it was maybe a decade ago when, was it the G7 summit, somebody actually put a number on how much global climate change was going to start costing economies around the world. And suddenly, all of these leaders lit up around the world and started to take this problem more seriously. Right? We would never have all the signatories for the Paris Climate Accords without that kind of recognition that this is real, and it's real because it has numbers. And in this case, the most powerful numbers are economic numbers. And so this idea of placing any kind of carbon tax on carbon in some ways places it from this idea of like, well, I don't believe in this and you believe in that too. It's real. People have to pay for it. It's a reality, and now goes into the accounting sheets for the corporations as they begin to make these decisions, which is what is real on a day-to-day basis, which is, are we in the red? Are we in the black? Is this going to be profitable or not? And so by putting it into a quantifiable form, I think we have a real advantage.
I was curious what you all thought about. He makes the argument that about nuclear power. So nuclear power is not an emitter. It does produce a type of pollution that is scary. But he makes the argument that it has killed, like direct nuclear power accidents have killed far fewer people than, for example, the impacts of pollution, like, particulate pollution from burning of fossil fuels, like by orders of magnitude fewer people. And nuclear power is non-emitting. Like, at what point does that become part of our solution? There's only so many rivers in the world for hydropower, right? Yeah. There's only, maybe you could put up all of the solar panels, but
I think that is such a hard question. This is not me as a professional expert kind of.
There's a lot of energy out there in nuclear power. There's a huge amount of energy available out there.
There is,
resources.
But the fact that it hasn't killed millions of people yet.
Right.
You just
do we have the time?
You just need.
Do we have the time?
Yeah, that's the question. Is like you look at
it's so dirty.
Like you look at it and it could be like one of the numbers is like 150 million people could die if we don't clean our pollution up. Like just like the 150 million people, like for reference, like he says it'd be like 25 Holocausts all over again. Mm-hmm. And if we're not going to fix the problem, like is it okay? We put up 50 nuclear power plants across the world, and maybe that kills 2 million people, but we end up saving 200 million in that process.
You're a utilitarian.
There's also
I just literally I read a quote from it. That's what I just read.
But there's also this intergenerational problem because going with nuclear power definitely kicks the can down the road, because it was 2 or 3 years ago.
But does it guarantee a road?
Well, not necessarily. So there's this documentary called Containment. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing, about how we have never really figured out how to contain our nuclear wastes. And it's been working so far, just like all of our environmental problems, because it's been small. There hasn't been that much nuclear waste, so it hasn't mattered, so it hasn't killed lots of people. And of course, it doesn't just kill people, like it actually disrupts systems. And so it's like climate change in being a system disrupting pollution if we lose control of it. And it lasts forever. At least carbon, like if we could kill ourselves off, and my
You're not recommending that.
my environmental classes reach that conclusion with an alarming regularity. And so I think I need to look again at how I'm teaching this.
Inspired.
But, you know.
That's
then,
preferable? No.
well, not that, but that at least the globe would recover from us.
Yeah.
And the
In
nuclear stuff.
100,000 years.
Ever? Well, but 100,000, like, I mean, we'll be gone.
Yeah.
But life again,
Right.
renews itself. Whereas nuclear problems could actually be like the death of life kind of thing. So that's just, I just get twitchy about it. I don't say no, but.
That's where we backed ourselves into, though, is like, do I want to have a road? Do I want, like,
Right.
Yeah.
those are we had choices 20 years ago, and now backs against the wall. What are you going to do?
I often, I was at the same time I was reading Uninhabitable Earth, I was reading Drawdown, Paul Hawkens' Drawdown book, in which he gets it's a project where you get something like a couple hundred scientists from 22 countries around the world to study global warming and come up with the top 100 solutions based on the economics of it and the kind of realistic nature of it. And if my memory serves, energy was not such a huge deal in the grand scheme of things on that top 100 list. It was important, but it wasn't like nuclear was not able to be pulled off the table with all of our other options. I think it's a bad option. I don't think it's an impossible option, but I think we have so many other things to try along the way. I think in the top 10 solutions, 2 of them are like solar roofing and solar farms, right? So nuclear doesn't show up in like the top tier solutions that will give you the most impact CO2-wise for the least amount of money spent and the most realistic in the short term. It's just not, in there in the top solution. So if we get caught up on just the kind of trickiness of trying to navigate this one option, I think we lose sight of this bigger picture, which is, we have 100 things to do, and that may be one of those 100, or it may not be, but we should sort of cross that bridge when we come to it.
Well, it would be interesting if there was a price put on carbon of where would companies go? Where would countries choose to go?
Yeah.
Like, what can you do? What choices would you make?
And that's why the companies are an interesting thing to go after, because, we were talking about individual action and how it doesn't really get much done because each one of us is so small. Well, each company is not so small. If you can get Exxon doing something different, or you can get, if we could go after the business sector, then getting individual agents, actors, to change their lifestyle, then you can start getting some real changes. And the taxes, like, they live and die by their taxes. And so that's a really powerful lever that we can use to go after them. And we can be shareholders and stuff, but a lot of the really powerful companies aren't publicly held. And so the taxes get everybody, and so that's why it's I agree, it's one of the most powerful things we have.
I'm still worried about what's deceptive about it. So you mentioned LEED buildings, green LEED, but I can see buildings that come down, which is a waste of something, where someone builds a LEED building, and you think of all the energy that went into the bricks and the whatever, or I remember people who talked about they'd replace the windows in their houses because that saved energy, but then it turns out to make a thermal window, make the window, there's as much, there's 60 years worth of energy in the window that you buy that saves the energy. So are we just deceiving ourselves?
Sometimes I think so. Like, if we look on the perspective of, like, if you're spending, let's say you're replacing 3 of the dorms built, like, let's say you're putting new windows in all the dorms, you're spending, I don't know, $200,000. Is there $200,000 that would have gotten 3 times more of that savings than putting new windows in?
Or does the energy it took to make those
energy.
new windows
Yeah, like that energy,
actually
in that
exceed
sense.
what you're saving?
Like, maybe you could have, I don't know.
Or how many years? I mean,
Yeah.
eventually it would
Yes, you
do
would say,
it.
but how many years would it take?
Yeah.
Well, I can do that in a few minutes, but if you have, go ahead.
I'm taking environmental design green, that's what it is, class, and I don't know anything about architecture, but we talked about like the buildings, and we visited like a cohort area, so they were like living together and living sustainably.
Co-housing.
Co-housing, yes.
yeah.
Co-housing like area in Worcester, and thank you. And so they were all like LEED buildings, but the whole point of it wasn't like to have like the status. It was to have buildings that would last longer and have like materials that would last longer.
Yeah.
Which is clearly a good. I think
Better
somewhere
than
between
these,
we
yeah.
should kill ourselves off, though. And
Again, I am not advocating, and absolutely clear.
but I
with
guess
my students,
it's
it
the
wasn't
illusion
me.
sometimes that we can just build our way in a good way and sustain the lives that we have. Or is the argument sort of kill ourselves off, or we can't have the lives that we have,
Yeah.
period.
Well, it's like people who buy electric cars, but then the electricity is generated by a coal-burning power plant. So really, what am I,
Yeah.
And the
what am I
footprint
getting?
on creating that car
Right.
and shipping it from wherever was
Yeah.
enormous.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
To say though, for me, I tend to think of these as like thought black holes. You can think your way out of or into just about anything, because the complications, I think, are really almost endless. You can pull the time scale out 50 or 100 years, or you can think about the economics of it, or the environmental emissions, or what came in before. Life cycle analysis makes things very complicated. It's very complicated to do a life cycle analysis of even, a reusable mug. I think for me, it's more important that people engage in these things and make those mistakes, and then figure out what those mistakes were as we all move on and realize that we can do that same thing better. Because if we don't engage in the first place, because we've kind of like run ourselves down the thought black holes to begin with, then we are still going, we're trying to go from not moving at all to moving, increasingly at 100 miles an hour is what we're going to need to move at pretty soon to catch up with the rate of change. So for me, and I think one of the, back to the author, what I like about the book is that he's actually not interested in how much the book depresses people or makes them feel bad. He says, you can feel any way you want about climate change. It doesn't really matter. What matters is whether or not you get into action about it, right? Because it's a little bit like a problem that just will not go away, no matter, and you can decide to engage now or engage later, and if you engage later, it's going to get bigger and harder, and if you engage now, it's just going to be as hard as it is now. But every contribution we make is like, what does he say? It's like, every action you take that is effective is like a tick in the right direction, and suffering ticks down a little bit. And somebody is going to have to pay for that at some point. And so what matters is how much we engage and how effectively we engage now, and learn from that engagement and become more effective, rather than trying to figure out the perfect way for us to attack this problem.
So I know the perfect part. If I bring it back home, if I think about the years, there's been a lot of progress on what we've saved on campus. At the same time, we have an enormous field house. We're heating a football field. We're building an arts center that I'm very happy about. And we have a new. Where do we end up on average? If you look over those years, because you've been working hard on this for some time, are those other changes we've made? Are we deluding ourselves, or are we?
But we've been able to cut our carbon in spite of the fact that we have all these new buildings. But so I'm happy about that. What makes me nervous is we're sort of at the point where we don't know how to get the rest of the way. We've sort of picked the low-hanging fruit, and now the question is how, as a college, how do we make that last push? And I think that's where somebody like a sustainability director who's professional is going to help. But the college is also going to have to spend money to do this.
Yep.
And so that's kind of my next question is, how much are we as a campus willing to spend to do our part?
And I'm also curious, at some point, we're going to have to live differently. So far we've managed to do all of this. I still get my lattes, right? I just put them in my reusable mug. And I still drive my car. It's a Prius now, but I still drive right? And so far we've worked very hard to sort of trim the fat off the edges without actually changing what we're doing.
And living better.
And living better and better, right? So
here, at least.
But at some point, maybe we can't play as many away games as we play. Yeah. Maybe we can't heat. Maybe we can't have air conditioning on campus. Maybe at some point, maybe we can't bring in as many speakers who are flying from wherever. At some point, the way that we live, the way that we function, the way that we practice is going to have to change somewhere. And it sounds like we're coming up on that. And then that's back to us individually being willing to have those discussions and do it.
Yeah, someone questioned me the other day. I play volleyball here, and we travel. We're going on a plane this weekend. And you ask yourself, well, couldn't you just play people closer? Well, I don't know. Like, there's different divisions. We're Division 1. We're in the Patriot League. The Patriot League has been established for the last, 100 years? So we go here, we go here, we go here. We take a plane to these 2 places, and we come back. And they're like, well, do you have to drive that? Like, someone was asking me this, and I was like, I don't know, you'd have to ask NCAA, it'd have to go through NCAA. They would have to change, the entire schedules would have to change. And it's just one of those things, like you think in just like a team, like can we travel less? We could, maybe. If we actually wanted to go to talk to NCAA and say we want to change the entire Patriot League and we want to play different people every year, we want to play people closer to home. And that's when it's, can you get an entire team or 300 teams? To decide on that? Like, you can hardly decide on a schedule one season. Like,
And who does the University of Hawaii play?
California.
And for our faculty too, like maybe we don't get airfare for our travel conference, for our conference travel or something like that. Maybe that they put that cost on us to.
I just read a horrifying article about the carbon footprint on academic scholarship. It is.
It's bad.
Or the conferences are online.
Right.
They're all
There are 2
video.
philosophy conferences that are doing that now, where you just
Virtual.
yeah.
I think this is the perfect illustration of exactly where we need to be, which is you start off thinking about some kind of lifestyle change, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't fly as much. But I think what often happens is people get caught up in sort of policing each other. Oh, you're flying too much, but aren't you environmentally friendly? Like, Wallace-Wells was at some talk, right? He's written a New York Times bestseller. He's trying to help us save the planet, and he's flying to places to do that. And then as soon as somebody says, like, oh, he has to catch a flight, people are like, boo, boo. Like, you're flying. Like it's some, like he's killing puppies. That's not how this is going to work. You can't just shame people because they're imperfect around these issues. Instead, what you do is you say, okay, flying less would be good. How can I now think about this in a more social, collective, and structural way? And what if our team started to write a letter to the NCAA, and maybe we could get our other buddy teams that we just played on board, and maybe they would consider redoing the schedule in a way that would make flying, that's going to be so much more impactful than like David Wallace-Wells not flying as much, right? One human being not flying as much when he has a really important message is not going to add up to anything. But getting the NCAA Patriot League to shift around so that their new schedule is, that's some real change.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the carbon footprint, we did an analysis. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but like the amount of carbon it takes for like even just like one team to travel an entire season, it's so sad. It's just like makes me squeamish. But that's like one of the things that like you have to look at, like if you're going to if like professors. I'm not sure if it's taken into our carbon account, but you have, I don't know how many students that are flying back to California are flying back home for breaks. Oh, yeah. Like you have one extra break in your year, that means that many more people are going home over break. That means that many more people are going on planes and they're using carbon and they're using fuel. And like, that's what people have to think about if you're going to have a new break in if someone's like, oh, maybe, I don't know, University of X wants to add a new break in their semester, that means there's 2 more trips that every single one of those students that has to fly home is going to have to take. And that's going to have to go into their carbon, and maybe that's where carbon tax comes in.
Yeah.
I want to be sure to open it to the rest of the audience. Is there anything big that I've missed? Is there anyone who wants to tell us what else we've missed that we should be talking about? And I can't see behind me, but Ellis can see behind me.
I'll look that way.
Everybody agrees 100% with everything that's been said, nothing's been missed.
There's a lot of inner, questions that you have to go through every day. I know you guys have talked about individuals versus groups, etc. There's always going to have to be an individual part of this, but I was wondering, how much of the solution is going to be doing more versus doing less. For instance, like taking fewer planes, like I would have to fly home, but I choose to drive my Prius. So that does a little bit less than flying on the plane, but takes more time out of my day. So that's one example of me flying less, but what would do you think the overall solution requires more action or people, paring down their lifestyle?
Yeah, that's been a big question. A lot of the environmental literature, there's often, how do I say it? There's allegedly a really tight link between the current the specific environmental difficulties we have and capitalism. That it's not just a coincidence that it's the most highly developed, most capitalistic countries that tend to have the largest footprint, although China, that's complicated. But and so some of the more speculative writing on that has suggested that not only do we need to sort of get on top of our pollution, but that we need to rework our entire economic systems, and that will lead to a different kind of society, that humans in their everyday lives will live differently in a green society than they do now, and that part of that would be more free time, less frantic running around. A lot of the writing is really utopian and questionable, but there's a strong thread that runs through the environmental literature that suggests that part of a green, sustainable lifestyle isn't about what you're consuming or not consuming, but about peace and tranquility and time and reflection, that there's a deep one-by-one character shift that would have to happen to get the practical environmental changes we're talking about. I get very speculative, but it's a solid thread in the literature.
But I think of my parents' stories about growing up in the Great Depression and how there was a common enemy and people were going to be giving up things and making choices and sacrificing for the greater good within capitalism. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like maybe that's what we need to move towards. Whoever thought you'd think the Great Depression was a great model. But just
so
that
first we
idea
need to
of like
crash the economy.
Well, World War II also
World War
is
II.
another example.
Yeah. That we have, there's
we're in this
something
together.
We're gonna sacrifice, and we're gonna, I'm not gonna have a birthday cake. It's gonna be okay.
Grow my own vegetables.
Yeah. So maybe that sort of idea would be, even within capitalism, a way to model it.
The more I study lifestyle movement stuff, the more convinced I become of its symbolic importance, but not its collective significance. So I think of it more and more as a kind of spiritual practice, lifestyle movements, like taking lifestyle choices. It will help you, and hopefully it will allow you to begin to see other things that you can do and other ways you can engage the system that are deeper and actually more impactful, that's just the starting point. It would be nice if collectively it added up, but sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. I think about, all of the vegans and vegetarians and how now we have Impossible and Beyond Burgers, and they're like these IPO childs that now Wall Street is in love with, and now we have Impossible Burgers at the Science Cafe, and and this is part of the solution, and part of that was driven by these individuals taking on this choice to say, I don't want to eat meat as much, and therefore I'm going to build this demand, and that demand came through the market, and now we have these options that are actually significantly, better for the environment than eating, a beef burger. Having said that, that's not always the way change works, and it's not often the way that lasting change can solve these problems. I think more of it a little bit like when Renee was, again, thinking about airlines and flying less, and then building that into an understanding of, what networks am I connected into that I can then help change, and then those network impacts actually add up to real significant change, right? So driving the Prius over and over again, I think about maybe that helps you then wrap your own head around how can I create more of an effective multiplier on this factor than it is symbolically just important for me to do this because, again, one vote is not going to call the election, right? It's everybody's vote coming together that moves the country in one way or the other.
I wonder in terms of symbolism, I fly a lot, so I'll be careful about that. But the planes are one of the easier things to hit, but in fact, housing, transportation, what we all drive is the bulk of what we're at. And I just want to make sure in the conversation we kind of focus attention on that, because there are some things that are easier to hit.
Oh, well, here's one.
Like beef, I'm trying not to eat beef, but I gather that's only really a huge impact, but a smaller percent. So, but that we also make sure we hit some of the bigger ones.
Like children.
Yeah.
Are you gonna? This is being recorded, so you want to no children.
We're all going to die with no children. All right.
So I asked them if it's even worth being educated. Now, is it worth having children? So
I know people who are actually
make that
really struggling with that question for environmental reasons. Should I bring children in? Right now, like, I'm one of the people, I'm probably going to be dead before it really gets bad. You're not.
No.
Right? Like, so this generation is the one that's going to get the first hit of whatever we don't manage to avoid. Children brought into the world by this generation are potentially facing a really difficult, savage world. That doesn't mean you don't have them, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, one of the biggest, me and my friends actually just talk about, like, in environmental sense, like, do we want to bring our kids into a world that's going to be like this? Like, at what point do you actually just, like, think about, like, is having a family that, like, at what point do you think about it? And it's like, of course, like, I want kids, like, but what kind of world do I want to bring these kids into? Like, you have to think, and I think one of the things, there's, like, some, but then you go into, okay, if the average is only one kid per family, like, if less women are having kids, then I can have as many kids as I want instead of, like, a one-child policy. Like, there's all these different things that go into it, but having a kid has, like, the biggest impact you could really have on your world is making a second. Like, is having another person that's going to use a lot of carbon, that's going to eat, but that you can help maybe teach them, like, okay, you're going to be vegan, you're going to do this and that and whatever you want to do, but they're another person and they're going to do what they're going to grow up into and deal with the problems that are going to be even worse than what I'm facing today.
It's interesting because I was talking about how nuclear power was not in the top 10. Plant-based diets are in the top 10 for the scientists agreeing that something that we can do and that would have a significant impact for the amount of money involved. Two of the others in the top 10 are educating women globally and giving them access to contraception.
Yep.
And it's part of what you guys are talking about, this idea that, like, what happens is you then slow down population growth, which then helps in these other ways. And
yeah, it's not necessarily having no children, but having
right.
one instead of 2, 3, 4, it makes a huge difference.
Other points, questions? They don't have to be questions, they can be points.
This kind of relates to the spread of information recently. So as like the push for a change increases, so does the resistance to this change. And that often comes in the form of, like, people that have doubled down on things that are just blatantly untrue. Like the rise of the flat earthers right now. It was big in the 80s, but now it's come back because, like, people are kind of banding together in their sense of ignorance, essentially. So I'm wondering, how do we fight this spread of information, especially now as we are defunding the agencies that provide us with these numbers to fight this, like, ignorance effectively? How do we fight this misinformation as, like, in this critical time?
Get rid of the internet. That's where it all comes.
It's all the internet.
The internet
Take it
was
down.
going to save us and we'd stop using paper
Right.
and then we'd all be better off. And
Yeah.
we were probably better off when we did read paper and use it all up, but had common, reliable sources of information.
So one thing that is happening is that the recognition that climate change is happening is growing, right? So you look at surveys that have been done over time and, like, how many Americans believe that climate change is happening, how many Americans believe that it's caused by humans. Those numbers are increasing. So it's, like, greater than 50%. Right, which is a good thing. And I think that's only going to continue increasing as we clearly see evidence of climate change happening in our daily lives, which we're going to see as heat waves kill more people and hurricanes are more powerful and we get these crazy storm systems at unusual times and whatnot. So I think eventually that problem is going to solve itself because people are going to see it every day. or maybe not every day, but it's going to be a part of our lived reality in a way that maybe around Earth isn't. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful in that regard. Just that information is. Yeah.
And we don't have to convince everybody. You know, we
Just voters.
we just need enough. Well, just enough of them, right? Because some of the people who don't believe this stuff
are paid
just
not to.
aren't going to, are either paid not to, right? I mean, there's the whole active disinformation campaign. There's a reason in America we have more trouble with this idea than we have elsewhere, right? So there's the active disinformation campaign. But a lot of the people who don't believe it, it's not that they're lacking information or lacking facts. They're just not interested in facts or information. And at some point, there are people that, okay, personal opinion, just aren't worth arguing with anymore. You know, if they're not open to having a discussion, then no amount of discussion or information is going to change their mind. It's dangerous to write people off that way, and it's socially costly in other ways. But at some point, if we can get enough of a majority, we just have to have a strong majority. We don't have to have everybody agree about climate change to be able to do something about it.
Yeah.
I would just add, though, I think part of it is our responsibility to do this communication. I was looking at something, it was an interview in Australia, and there was an academic from the US talking about climate change, and there's a huge audience of Australians, many of whom were essentially denying that climate change existed. And this academic was trying to tell them that, no, it's real and the data is real, but he was terrible at it because he was an academic, right? He's bumbling over the data and he's misspeaking and he's talking, and they're doing these shots of the audience. The audience is like, you know, they have no way to make sense of it, and it's because we're terrible communicators as academics. But one of the things that I think about even in this context, first of all, many of you have read the book, but I'm not going to assume everybody has read the book that has come here, right? And even the idea that like you're going to take this book and pass it on to people and they're going to read it just to be based on your recommendation is totally unrealistic, right? You have to find ways to communicate this information, and we as academics to communicate this information that is easily accessible and makes sense to other people, and they can access it in 5 minutes on their phone to get the like first step, the baby step going, and then they're interested, and then they find something else compelling, and you sort of walk them through that step by step. I noticed some people leaving earlier, so I want to get this out before everybody leaves. Before I got here, I decided, you know, the thing I hate most about going to talks is leaving feeling frustrated at the end of the talk, and so I wanted some kind of resource to go to, like once the Fishbowl is over, where do you go, what do you do, what's the next step, etc. So I went online and I created a Google Doc. It's a couple of pages and has some links to videos and websites and etc. You know, voter registration, because you know Wallace-Wells talks about how important it is to get engaged in the political process. If you go to bit.ly, bit.ly/earthfishbowl. So bit.ly/earthfishbowl. The Google Doc is there, and you can comment on it or contribute to it, and I can add things to it. But it's this idea that if we want to combat this problem of all those people that don't believe it, you know, you're not going to get them to believe it by handing them a copy of Uninhabitable Earth. That's not going to happen. You need to start with, oh, here's this really cool 5-minute video of Greta Thunberg that's totally inspiring because she's a 16-year-old and she's doing this amazing stuff. And so you hand them that video, and then they get inspired by that, and then you give them the next thing, and then pretty soon they realize, oh, well, there's data behind this. Yeah, this makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, there's a few points like within that I just want to make. First of all, if you want to get involved, you can join Eco Action.
That's on the Google Sheet.
Okay. But then in the sense of talking to people, I mean, especially so in the sense, so for the Green Funds, we did, I'm assuming people in this room voted, hopefully, fingers crossed. But there were people that were against the Green Fund. And somebody came up to me and was like, Renee, did you read this post? Like, they hate it. They're like, are you going to respond? Are you going to rebuttal? And I was like, no, I'm not. I don't have time right now to rebuttal. I have time to go get more people to vote. And some people were kind of shocked by that, but I was kind of like, it's truly not worth the time I have right now. We have 2 more days of voting, and that's what I'm going to spend doing, is getting people to vote. Because what ended up happening is we won by a bunch, but I think what also happened is a lot of people didn't know the vote was going on. And so when we went up to them and we said, hey, like, here's this vote, will you vote yes for it? First of all, you have a positive person coming in about this vote, and they didn't even know, like, a lot of people didn't know what was going on. And I think that's where, like, one of the moments I realized is, like, you really do have to just figure out where you're spending your time, and you have to decide, like, educate first of all, and say, like, at what point do you just kind of have to say, like, no, get more people on board, don't worry about fighting those that are against. So that point, and then also talking on like the grand scheme of things, not just the Green Fund, but if there's somebody that is like really, I feel like I'm just talking this way, I apologize. But on the grand scheme of things, like if there's somebody that's not, like doesn't believe in climate change, like it doesn't matter, but maybe they're economics major, and you're saying, okay, but like how much is it gonna cost us? Like, can we limit the cost? Like, doesn't it save us money? Like, if you care about money, like, don't you care that if your windows aren't very good or your lights are good, that it's wasting money, it's wasting energy? And you have to just kind of change, like, first of all, try and know that person. And if you can change the conversation to something that they're interested in, like if they're a skier, maybe it's about less snow during this time of year. Things like that. But if you're gonna like talk to people, like seriously, like talk to people around you and have those conversations, like bring it up. Like don't just let it go by, and don't let your mind just sit there in like pain and agony. Talk to somebody about it and make it into a positive or whatever you need to do.
And econ majors really just care about maximizing utility and being happy. So really, that's what you have to focus on. Ignore the money, happiness.
Yeah.
Are you happy? Could you be happy?
3 cups of coffee, 2 cups of coffee. I learned something.
You did.
Other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, so I guess I had heard about it before, but I got like reminded about like the carbon tax, and I was just interested in like finding out if there's other like incentives for corporations or companies who like account for a lot of pollution to like incentivize them against that, like if they're more like this profitable means for them to carry out their production. Yeah, like other methods.
Yep. So there are, for example, in New England, the RGGI, I forget what it stands for, but they put quotas on carbon, and they're trying to get companies then to, if you are going to exceed that, then you're going to have to buy credits from somebody else. It's still going to cost you, so it ends up being a price mechanism, but it's not a tax. So there are certainly things like that are available, but the carbon tax has been used in the European Union pretty successfully, and companies responded quickly because it was affecting their bottom line. But
What about like just regulations or lawsuits?
Yeah, you
or...
can do regulations, and that a lot of the Green New Deal is based on regulations because the people who set up the Green New Deal were worried about this idea of a tax, and people are going to flip out if we say there's going to be a new tax.
Yeah.
So their
like
focus is on
fines.
regulation and stuff, where it just says this is what you have to do and how you do it, and if that's what's going to work, and that's what people are going to find acceptable, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But it is harder to write regulations, and it's quicker, faster, do the tax, which is...
It's kind of self-enforcing, whereas the regulations require inspectors and...
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So traditionally, command and
More
control
expensive.
regulation has not been
Yeah,
very...
I'll take it at this point if that's what we need to
Better
do. But from a minimize the process, I would rather just do taxes. But there are also things like the STAR efficiency, where companies are awarded your green star if you meet these certain goals and things like that, or LEED buildings. So there are ways to get companies to think about it in ways that are not financial, but.
So if I look at what Walmart supposedly did or something, I'm usually skeptical about Walmart. Should I say, if we push companies to be green, they really do that, or they see a financial move in it? I'm certainly skeptical when I see companies that say, I can buy my way through their products into energy efficiency, right? Like, we should always be skeptical, but are companies, are those incentives real? Are they?
One of the things that happens, there's some research or some case studies that often environmentally friendly manufacturing and production is cheaper. It's just you're wasting, you have less waste, you need less raw materials, and so they're still doing all of the research on this. You'd know this better than I am, but But often environmentally responsible practices are better, just cheaper, more effective, and that's before you even get into the fact that you can then advertise yourself as green. One of my favorite books is Business Lessons from a Radical Industrialist. It's by Ray Anderson, and he had he's a CEO of a carpet company, which is like pure petroleum, all petroleum all the time, and he took his company to almost zero impact in like 12 years or something. And he wrote a book about it. And it's just a book from a CEO to other CEOs. It's not an academic thing.
How do you do it? Through recycling?
They did 1,000 different things. They made it a company identity thing, and part of it is they restructured the company to make the company more democratic. They changed everything. And he has chapter by chapter with here's what we spent, and here's what we saved, and here's where we did all this stuff. And so that's just pure business practice. That's changing business practice and the idea of what you're doing before we even start trying to incentivize or just force.
Carrot or stick, yeah.
So, that won't always be the case, but we can at least push people to look for those things when they're in business.
I just published a paper on greenwashing, and the bottom line for your question is you shouldn't probably trust Walmart. There are a lot of track records from larger companies in which they can do things like turn everything into CFLs, and you've read a story on it, compact fluorescent light bulbs, or now it's LED light bulbs, right? And then it looks very environmental because they just purchased a bazillion of these light bulbs, and so the carbon footprint is, they're not emitting a huge amount of carbon now, and yet essentially it's just a scale illusion, right? That they do that because they save money. They actually have no particular
I'm okay with that if they save the...
But in fact, like percentage-wise, they use that to distract people to look over here so that they can do all the other bad stuff over here. And so it's very tricky, I think, for consumers to navigate this because for now 15 years I've been tracking companies along these lines, trying to figure out transparency that will allow us to see which companies are doing the real work and which companies are just fooling us. And it is a lot more cost effective to fool the public than it is to take on the responsibility and the sustainability in a real way. And it's very difficult for the average consumer to do this. Having said that, I really do think that we have new roles now, that we're not just, as much as Wallace-Wells talks about how we need to get into politics to make these political changes, if we leave out the corporate sphere, we're not going to get the political changes done because they will help fund the opposition of the political changes. So we need to put pressure on corporations to do the right environmental thing. And one thing they care about more than anything else is their brand image. And so if you can begin to assault that brand image to kind of like demonstrate that they're not as environmental as they seem, or you get kind of viral memes going around how they're not living up to whatever they're supposed to be, they will often react because they see that in terms of dollars and cents sales. And companies like Apple are able to do better environmentally and take the top profit spot in the world, whereas it used to be dominated just by companies like ExxonMobil, who were the absolute bottom of the barrel when it comes to environmental stuff because they just made more profit that way. But people have held companies like Apple to a higher standard, and they have essentially decided to meet them at least part of that way there.
And so that's pressure from the outside on the corporate sector, and another thing you can do is get into the corporate sector and don't be evil.
That could be a good way to end. Is there anything urgent that we should raise?
Just like a twofold question. What gives you hope in the midst of this challenge, and also what is your view with regards to reproducing? I personally, I think it's a slippery slope to rely upon contraceptive and the limiting of childbirth, because I feel like we're eliminating the potential for future generations to solve the problem. And I also think that we're denying future generations from enjoying life on Earth just because we were too lazy or ignorant to face up to the problems that we created ourselves.
Well, just as someone who has 2 children, I'll say that they are a great incentive to keep trying to do good things, right? Just, there's no stronger motivation to try to treat the world well now so that it is okay for them in the future.
It is one of the most real wake-up calls for people as they go into adulthood, is once you have little ones, right, suddenly you have much more invested in the future, whereas if you don't, it's you're in and out, and whatever happens as long as you're not there. But once you have this investment in these future generations that are very personal, and that's how we usually react as human beings to things that are very personal to us, then suddenly you have a stake in the future. You have an investment because you want your kids and your grandkids to have it better than you. So I think, again, we need to move out of this dichotomy of no kids or 100 kids. We need to come into some kind of viewpoint that allows people to have children, but also have some level of choice over whether or not they want to have children, and understand what they're going to do, and maybe also take on the responsibility that they are going to educate those children to try to help them make a positive change around some of these problems that they're going to be walking into, because they're inheriting it. But what gives me hope, your earlier question, is back to Wells. I really feel like I resonate with him on this issue of, in some ways, what gives me hope is there's no way out of this problem. It's a little bit like watching your hand go slow motion towards a fire. You can start to pull back whenever, and it'll take a while for your hand to pull back, but, so one way or another, your hand's going to get burned. The question is, do you want to leave it in there for a while until it cooks really well, or do you want to start pulling back because it's a terrible idea? And it's really up to you, right? It's up to all of us. No one is going to save us from this. It is each of us is going to contribute, and it's a problem that we cannot get out of. It's a little bit like, if you are a comic book nerd, it's a little bit like the Watchmen, right? The manufactured alien invasion so that the world comes together to attack in a common way this outside problem, right? Global warming is the alien invasion, and the idea is that everybody, the only solution to that tragedy of the commons is cooperation. Every country on this planet has to get on board and essentially start to work towards it, because the problem will not go away. It just won't.
Ironically, while I have no kids, I'm skeptical of the have no kids the answer thing, because I've watched in my lifetime that families have gotten smaller as households have literally grown to twice the size.
Yeah.
So there's a way, if you look anywhere we live, if I compare the square footage of the house I grew up in to today, so there is a kind of illusion, I think, that's around. If we don't have more kids, we can somehow, when I was a kid, what a kid needed to get along was less. I miraculously survived that. So I'm wary of the argument that way, even though, as I said, I have no children. Finding hope, I think for me, I would go back to Kendy's point about you shape the kind of life you want to shape because it's what you do, and I realized that when I think ethically about anything in the world, there are ways that I am complicit in all sorts of things. Like, I could lose hope, my complicity in all sorts of things just by virtue of living. It's pretty depressing. I could do more on all sorts of things. I think that the best thing I can do is try and go on and realize, sort of a better world doesn't create itself. I've got to be active in doing it. I've got to encourage other people to do that. And, I'm not sure. I like to look back at the 60s. There was the whole, before Norman Borlaug, before the Green Revolution, we were all going to starve to death anyway. There are some ways we did find our way through that and out of it, but I like to believe there is more hope without ignoring what may be true, may well be true in the book. So, but I think we have to at least live our lives in as purposeful a way as we can to make the contribution that we can. But if anyone else has a different.
Yeah, I'll leave the reproductive question for 10 years in the future when I feel like going toward it. But in the sense of hope, there is hope. There's so much hope, and there's if I had zero hope, I would not be here right now. I'll tell you that.
Be on a beach somewhere.
Yeah, and it is you have to in the sense of being hopeful. I think it's crucial that we're hopeful of what we can do, and I do have a lot of hope, and I think I've been be able to I think the youth climate strike definitely actually gave me hope, because you could see visually the sense of okay, there's actually millions and millions and millions of people actually working towards this issue every day, and while your individual choices can make a slight difference, people are individually are making differences, and we are making an impact, and we're organizing, and we're coming together, and we're pushing and we're pushing hard. We are asking people and demanding people that they make changes, and we're making action locally, and we're just, I think the biggest thing is if you keep demanding and like in your own personal sense, like actually demand more from not only yourself, but demand it more from your family, demand more from your professors. If your professors are actually printing out like an entire book for you every day, like call them out. Seriously, like go for it. And like it doesn't matter, like it's more important for you to call each other out and then be honest than it is to just let these problems go by, because you let them go by, it's going to have even farther future effects. So
be willing to be self-critical.
Yeah.
You
Point
know,
thumbs too.
So,
And call out your politicians.
Yeah.
Send them an email every week. What did you do this week? What are you going to do next week? What are you doing about climate change?
Yeah.
It's great. Like in your Gmail, just you start typing their name and boom, there it is.
well, thank you everyone for being here. Oh, did we have one?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
I see other colleges that are neutral, and I think it's like incredible. And I just find it insane that we are already.
Your department?
We're trying.
More time, I feel like we've already do so many steps to get there. Like green climate, I think is amazing, but we're pulling it out of like another like $10 for the students. So it's like, yeah, we have to make low costs to pay. How are we going to do that?
What I think having a sustainability director, I think eco-action and the action of all the students, because we've been pushing for sustainability director for a long time, and it took them getting all those signatures to make it happen.
Yeah.
So I think it's becoming more important to the college, and it's
Yeah, we have a 200, so there's
I'm
that 20, I think it's 2040. 2040 carbon neutral plan.
Yeah.
So that's our goal. I think it was made in 2007. There was a lot done for it. The 2 new buildings that are going up will both be LEED equivalent. They won't be certified because it's money that gets spent on that certification. So those will both be certified. They will be like that standard. And so that's like part of the carbon neutral plan is any new building goes up will be LEED equivalent. But there's in the STARS report, I don't know if anybody knows what it is, it's just like an academic like standard, but one of my personal goals is like pushing on the sustainability director that we are hiring is to be gold standard in like the next 5 to 7 years. And like because there's all these little charts and stuff that go into it, like there's academics, but there's also facilities and there's transportation and there's just all these little parts and pieces that go into it that we don't realize.
Yeah,
And
it's making
making
people
those
think
little
about it and
changes.
making decisions about it. Yeah, yeah. But the college is committing in ways that I have not seen in the past, and it makes me hopeful.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you, everyone.